Break free of the trauma bonds in narcissistic abuse. Do you fear that if you listen to what you're unhappy about in a relationship, that it might be impossible to be happy with anyone? Or do you fear terrible retribution, comeuppance, or profound humiliation if you dare to move away from a friend or partner who's treating you poorly? And does it seem like having someone there is a lot more important than expecting them to treat you the way you want to be treated? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, then today's video on trauma bonds versus attachment bonds could be for you. If you had a narcissistic parent and no other viable adult to attach to, then it may have been necessary to forge a trauma bond to that narcissistic parent in order to survive. I've talked about aspects of trauma bonds in a lot of the videos on this channel, but today I'm going to focus on what a trauma bond is, how it's different from an attachment bond, how a trauma bond can make it hard to create distance from a narcissistic abuser, and finally offer a tactic to operate out from under the influence of the trauma bond's guidance. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse in individual therapy and through my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, which has an accompanying private Facebook community. And to do this, we take a three-pronged approach to recovery. The first involves making sense of what happened. Next is gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, whether psychological, emotional, or physical distance. And third is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. Well, today's video falls under the category of gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser. An important part in being able to gain distance from a narcissistic abuser is taking care of yourself. To that end, I've created this free webinar that offers 7 self-care tools to help you in the process of recovering from narcissistic abuse. And you can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here to view the webinar. Well, how is the scapegoat survivor set up to create a trauma bond to a narcissistically abusive parent? Well, as I've stated, a narcissistically abusive person feels a deep sense of often unconscious worthlessness and shame that they can't tolerate and cope by insisting on the opposite, that they're instead worth more than others or more special than them. Then they expect and influence others to reflect back this inflated view of their self-worth. Last, they lack empathy for the feelings of others, as this would get in the way of being able to seamlessly use others to prop up their inflated self-esteem. So being in a relationship to such a person is a real one-sided affair. So imagine the experience of a child born to such a parent where the other parent in the relationship doesn't afford that child much of a different option. The child's own inner world is not going to matter to the narcissistically abusive parent. That parent may have ideas about how he wants to feel around the child. And if the child gratifies the parent, then a type of sort of pseudo harmony may occur. But if the child frustrates the narcissistic parent in any way, then that parent can punish the child in one of two ways: actively sort of hurt and will punish the child, or second, withdraw from the child, in essence, threaten abandonment. And for the child, it very much can feel like I'm either faced with annihilation via attack or abandonment via this sort of withdrawal. The child in this situation learns that they experience these terrible outcomes if they don't make the narcissistic parent feel about him or herself the way that parent wants to feel about themselves. And I think this is the trauma in the term trauma bond for the child of a narcissistically abusive parent. That is that everything hinges on making that parent feel good about themselves, and nothing that's sort of solely about the child can really matter in this type of situation. Now let's contrast this with what an attachment bond looks like for a child born to a good enough or non-narcissistic parent. For this child, the parent has a non-possessive curiosity, compassion for, and desire to facilitate the growth of the child's mind and developmental strivings. That, the parent is going to be happy when the child is happy with him or herself, when the child is happy with the child's self, that is. And there's an implicit separation between the parent and the child's mind, and the parent maintains and respects this boundary. And a parent like this is also managing their own emotional well-being fairly well and is therefore available to the child as a resource to help that child manage his or her own emotional experience. And you'll notice in this description that the child doesn't face any sort of threat of annihilation nor abandonment in any of it. Sure, there are moments of frustration for the child in relationship, to this sort of good enough parent, but these are fairly infrequent and tend to be repaired by the two of them. Well, there's an author named Joseph Schwartz who wrote an academic journal article that clarified the difference between an attachment bond versus a trauma bond, and I found this article to be immensely helpful. First, let's start with what an attachment bond looks like. Well, as you can see on the screen, an attachment bond is based on love, reciprocity, and caring. It develops slowly, not quickly or instantly. Another feature of an attachment bond is that it is experienced as essential for survival. Proximity to the attachment figure in an attachment bond leads to feeling safe. Individuation, in the sense of feeling that one is a distinct person from the other in the bond, is very much possible in an attachment bond. And there's still a sense of dependency, healthy dependency on the other person in the bond. And in an attachment bond, there is the opportunity to feel autonomous and free while remaining attached to the other person in the bond. And now let's contrast these features with what a trauma bond looks like along these dimensions. A trauma bond is based on terror, domination, and unpredictability. Also, a trauma bond develops instantaneously. And again, a trauma bond is experienced as essential for survival too. And importantly, proximity to the other person in the trauma bond leads to conflicting feelings. You might feel relief, alarm, or a numbness. And when it comes to individuation in a trauma bond, you are not separate to that other person in the bond, but rather you're an extension of the other's needs. You have to be the way the other wants you to be. And when it comes to autonomy or freedom in a trauma bond, it doesn't exist. The victim in this trauma bond is obedient to the will of the other as a necessity to survive. Well, there's a movie that does a great job of illustrating the difference between an attachment bond and a trauma bond also. It's called Gone Baby Gone, and it has Casey Affleck as the main character and his wife, Bridget Moynihan. And they play neighborhood detectives who are also helping police detectives, one of them played by Ed Harris, solve the case of a missing girl who was kidnapped from a woman in the neighborhood. And that woman was known to use and traffic drugs and in essence, too, routinely neglect and endanger her young daughter. And I hate to be a spoiler here, but in the end, it becomes clear that her kidnapping, the daughter's kidnapping, was orchestrated by the chief of police, played by Morgan Freeman, and also assisted by Ed Harris, the detective, so that the child could be raised by the police chief and his wife, who could actually offer the daughter a loving and safe upbringing. Well, Casey Affleck's character was steeped in the Catholic Church and had a real honor thy parents outlook on the world. So when he discovers that the girl was actually living with the police chief's family, he's in this moral dilemma of, whether to return the girl to her biological mother or let her continue living with the police chief's family, where she seemed very happy. And I won't say what he chooses, but encourage you to see the movie if you haven't yet. It's really great. But in Gone Baby Gone, the moral dilemma is whether to return the kidnapped child to her biological parent, whom it seems she may share a trauma bond with, or let the daughter stay with people who have treated her well enough that she seems to be developing an attachment bond to, the police chief and his wife. And I know how most of you watching this channel would vote as to what should be done in this situation. And believe me, that includes me. I would definitely vote for her to stay with the folks who are treating her well. But they have to see the movie if you haven't already to find out. Well, for the person who had to forge a trauma bond to a narcissistically abusive parent, it's imperative that they also learn to ignore themselves. That the child in this situation learns that paying attention to him or herself results in one of those two terrible traumas of either annihilation or abandonment by and from the narcissistic parent. The child doesn't have someone else who's benignly paying attention to that child. So for the child to do this, pay attention to themselves, and expect the same from without, only results in profound and utter disappointment. And the resulting feelings can feel so unsurvivable to the child that it's actually adaptive to find a way to pay less attention to themselves. In fact, the child who had to forge a trauma bond to a narcissistic parent may even find it difficult to recognize his or her self in the world. That life can feel passable so long as they are not aware of themselves as distinct beings. And this, I think, makes a lot of sense given how dangerous in that chart it was to be autonomous and free, that was absolutely forbidden in the trauma bond. In addition, being aware of themselves can interfere with doing what's necessary to maintain the trauma bond to the narcissistically abusive parent, when it was in play. And I think this is why being traumatically bonded to a narcissistic abuser can make gaining distance so difficult for the survivor. The premise of recovery from this kind of abuse involves paying attention to oneself. Yet it's this act of paying attention to oneself that can feel like one is inviting the very traumas one has been seeking to spare oneself all one's life. You may have had to keep your focus on what is going on around you at all costs in order to stave off the anxiety or even terror that might flood in otherwise. Well, here are some of the warning signals that can occur that I think stem from the trauma bond with the narcissistically abusive parent when considering separating from that narcissistically abusive parent or family. And then they can include wondering if you're making all of this up. Or another common fear at this point is that if you pay attention to yourself and what you like versus don't like in relationships, that you'll never find someone whom you're satisfied with. And this fear about never being able to be satisfied with anyone, I think, can seem very reasonable, yet directly mirrors the dilemma faced earlier in life. That if you decided you weren't happy with your narcissistically abusive parent, then you would have been left with no one to attach to. And that's just not an option at that phase in life. Well, I don't think these concerns are necessarily what they seem to be at face value, but rather serve the function to keep one in the only kind of bond one may have known in one's life. That is the trauma bond to the narcissistic abuser, and to not do the thing of pay attention to oneself that would have gotten the person either destroyed or left prior. Well, what can be done to help you break the chains of the trauma bond and progress towards an attachment bond with yourself and with others? In the earlier chart, Schwartz points out how an attachment bond is built slowly while a trauma bond develops pretty instantly. I think that's useful to frame what I'm about to say because this is a process that requires compassion and patience towards oneself, and compassion and patience when such compassion and patience doesn't feel available. This week in the Facebook group that accompanies my online course for recovery from narcissistic abuse, I asked members to post moments of progress they noticed during the week, and it really doesn't matter how big or small they are. And sometimes someone may experience a lot of challenging, thoughts and feelings or life events, but they may put as progress their attitude towards those challenging experiences. So the progress was actually contextualizing how this challenging week wasn't permanent, and that they weren't kind of frustrated or impatient with themselves for experiencing these challenges, but rather had a very supportive and, again, compassionate attitude towards themselves as they went through and had to experience some of these challenging thoughts and feelings. Well, that being said, I think one way to gradually and compassionately help yourself out of the trauma bond is to make it an intention to pay attention to yourself throughout your days. So practices like the self-care tools in the webinar that I mentioned, or connecting to your bodily experience, say via daily yoga practice or exercise regimen, I think can be very helpful in this regard, because engaging in these activities puts you in the center of your own attention. And it may not work right away in terms of one fell swoop, but I think that with continued efforts to center yourself in your own life, the window with which it feels safe to do so can get larger and larger. And with that can come a greater sense of deservedness and sense of safety to seek out bonds that are really about attachment, as opposed to trauma-based bonds that are really about avoiding very grave dangers. Well, thanks for watching this week's video. I hope you found, talking about the difference between trauma and attachment bonds helpful in the course of recovering from narcissistic abuse. And I look forward to posting again next Sunday. And again, thank everyone for your continued engagement and support of the channel. Take care.